Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and welcome to the 4th episode of the Classic Plus Corner, where we talk about all things related to Classic Plus. And today we're going to be talking about the fact that you just cannot fix everything in this game for Classic Plus. And this was kind of inspired by the last video that I made after reading some of the comments, so it's a bit of one of the off-the-cuff videos, so it's going to be a bit more informal than normal, but we'll see if we can manage to put together something that's coherent and makes sense. So there's a lot of kind of problems that people want to fix with the game going into Classic Plus, and many of them have pretty decent solutions, or solutions that we've kind of already came across or encountered in other versions of the game that we can kind of implement in Classic Plus, or we have pretty good ideas for maybe how we'll deal with certain things. But then there's other things that are just a lot harder to fix. And I think that sometimes, as a community, when we're thinking and brainstorming of things, we get into this trap of trying to fix every potential problem. And I think the last video is a great example of a problem that is just fundamentally very difficult to fix. And that is the idea of kind of like vertical progression in the game like this, when you want vertical progression, right? Because, like I argued in the last video, I think most people that play Classic, they like the idea of progressing from content to content there's like a distinct upgrade in the gear rewards for each level you go up. They like the idea of Blackwing Lair being harder than Molten Core. They like the idea of AQ being harder than, Blackwing Lair, and so on and so forth. If you accelerate it too much, like you just skip a whole expansion, like you kind of do with the Burning Crusade, we provide that little catch-up thing. People don't like that as much, but they like the idea of progressing incrementally from one thing to the next. And when you have a system like that, you're kind of always going to run into issues with, like, what do you do with the prior tiers of content? Now, as people have pointed out, there's already kind of ideas and remnants of ideas that have been put in place in the normal Classic game, which mostly have to do with loot to try and protect these things. For example, Thunder Fury exists in Molten Core, Bone Reaver's Edge, really great weapon, Onslaught Girdle, Quick Strike Ring, these sort of things exist in MC. Then you have things like DFT and Blackwing Ray Rejuvenation Gem. They're kind of strategically placed items that are in mostly slots that are kind of hard to get items for, and they kind of do a good job of keeping some of the older raids alive. But the problem still exists that once you kind of get 10, 15 raids deep, these things are ultimately going to, just not actually, you're just not going to be worth it to run these raids at all, theoretically, because the idea is you would have certainly replaced everything once we're like 10 to 15 tiers deep. Like, there's not going to be a item in Molten Core that's better than something that's better in tier 10. I would hope not, right? So that problem kind of still exists. And realistically, I think that we just have to kind of deal with problems like that in a way that may not seem intuitive, right? That's why I mentioned just kind of like retiring things, or, some other people had some interesting ideas where, like, I think you could maybe like reduce the difficulty and then let people, go into there and do it as kind of like a fewer amount of people in order to get transmog or something like that. If they have transmog in the game, maybe you could add pets to it or something like that, just to kind of keep the content as something that people can do, but it's not really something that people are going to be kind of, going out of their way to do, if that makes sense, right? But it still kind of keeps the content in the game, if you don't want to remove it entirely. So stuff like that's fine. There's games like Destiny 2 that have just straight up removed content. That was kind of unpopular, though. So, I don't think that people really want to do that. But ultimately, there's going to be some things that are just really hard to deal with. And then there's going to be other things that are very easy to deal with. So, conversely, some problems you could easily fix in Classic Plus are things like, Paladins only having one really viable spec. Okay? Elemental Shamans having like no mana in PvE, or Shadow Priests having like no mana in PvE. So you can kind of fix these things, right? And it's not really that hard to do that, but something like progression in a vertical progression system, that's just, well, not progression itself, but the idea of content becoming outdated, that's something that is just going to be really hard to fix. And you can fix anything, keep in mind, right? But sometimes there'll be consequences for how you fix it. And I mentioned this in, I don't know if it was the last video or video before that, but there's this game Corepunk. It's like an upcoming MMO that is trying to survive out there right now. And at one point, they were so anti-RMT that basically every item in the game that you had was basically bind on pickup, right? So you had to craft everything by going out into the world and getting all the items yourself, and then getting the crafting profession, crafting it, and then potentially moving on to something else. Like if you wanted to, there's two different systems. There's one for armor, one for weapons. So you'd have to kind of, level one up and then level the other one up. And it was a huge pain is the idea. But it did prevent people from essentially doing any sort of RMT or anything like that. And you could kind of do the same thing in WoW if you wanted, right? You could make it so that you had to go out and get everything. You could even change it so that you could have access to all the gathering professions and, all the professions at once. You just had to level them up or something like that. And all the items are, bind on pickup or whatever. But that would kill a large aspect of what people enjoy about with the game, right? They like the idea of interacting with other players and trading and things of that nature. So there's a compromise, We realize there's going to be some RMT, but, we're kind of okay with that to keep certain systems in the game, right? And now, obviously, people are going to laugh and they're going to be like, well, then, why don't we have GDKP in the game? But from my perspective, GDKP is not something that is worth saving. However, the core idea of having something like professions in the game, that is worth saving. So we can solve any problem. It's just about the cost. And I've seen a lot of interesting comments in the comment section here, and I do kind of want to just go over a couple of them. Not to like pick on people, because I love that you guys are talking about this in the comment section, and it's good to have ideas, so it's never a bad thing to talk about ideas and kind of get through them. But there's some suggestions here that I think people haven't really fully thought out. So let's kind of get into a couple of these. There was one about like basically having really unique items, and the guy specifically mentioned like having blink on kind of like a chess piece or something like that would allow other classes, like other than mage, to blink, kind of like Enigma in Diablo 2. That's what he likened it to. And, you could do that, right? And if you had that item in Molten Core or something like that and it was rare, then people would go back to Molten Core to farm it. Okay? Or the idea could be that it's not just about going back to Molten Core, but another version of this was that you have items like this that kind of exist on a spectrum. So, for example, you release things in kind of almost like tiers of 3, where it's like Molten Core, Blackwing Layer, and AQ would actually have similar eye-level gear, but they would just contain items that did different things in them. So you might have the Blink chest in one of them. You might have a bracer that does Frost Nova, something like that. And another one, you have a weapon that does something weird in the third one. And they'd all kind of be similar eye level. And then, maybe you would move up an eye level for the next bracket, and then it would be 3 more raids of the similar eye level, right? And that would kind of at least extend the time you have, right? So you'd basically get layers of raids where you'd have like layer 1 would be like 3 or 4 raids deep, then layer 2 would come up, and the items levels would be like a little bit higher, and then, there's like another layer there, and you could survive a long time without having to do the squish I was talking about earlier. So something like this doesn't seem terrible on the surface, but there's a couple problems that I see. It's like the first one is like, I know that we're not trying to make an esport here, right? We don't need anything perfectly balanced, and a lot of people would argue that that's kind of the direction that retail went, and that's why the game kind of got bad, and that's when you start to lose some of your identities, when you over-homogenize things. But at the same time, I think that, allowing a player to really customize their character with gear is a very tricky path for an MMO, especially an MMO like this that's set out to have specific roles, right? Because it's kind of one thing if you have a blank canvas character like in RuneScape, and then you can equip anything at any given time to make the character do certain things, and that's sort of the point of the game. But WoW has a built-in role structure already with the classes, and kind of giving a class something it shouldn't have access to can create a lot of imbalance and make the class very oppressive and very broken. Particularly in PvP, that's the area where there's going to be, I'd say, the biggest problem, right? Because it's always going to be way more frustrating when you have to encounter that class as another player, as opposed to, a class just overperforming in PvE. But still, it could have pretty bad implications for PvE as well. And then on top of this, only certain people are going to have access to this ability, right? So if you have like a plate chest for warriors, that only they can use or something like that gives them blink, then every warrior is going to want this chest, and presumably it's going to be pretty rare. And if it's not rare, it's almost sort of worse, because now every warrior is just blinking around everywhere. But if it's not rare, then you have this problem of like some warriors are completely broken and overpowered, and other warriors aren't, right? And people will be like, oh, but it's fun, and it's like, no, it's only fun for the guy that has the item, guys, right? You really do have to like keep in mind and consider like all the players that he's going to be bumping into, and just like tilting to ad nauseum because we have a warrior that can blink in the game and things of that nature, right? So I'm all for keeping some of the identity, I think, of the items that Classic has, like I was talking about in the prior video with like weapons and things of that nature, where there's some in like kind of the Burning Crusade and beyond, the homogenization of weapons has already sort of started. And in Classic WoW, we have some weapons that kind of do some unique things or are just uniquely powerful. But even something like a weapon being uniquely powerful, maybe being overstated for a bracket, is nowhere near like as devastating as have something like a blink added to your character or something crazy like that, right? So those things work a lot better, I feel like, in games with a specific purpose is to kind of create and customize your character. WoW is not really one of those games. And we have to be careful because you're never going to be able to do everything in one game. And a lot of times people like ideas in other games, but the problem is they're not kind of realizing that the game is built around that being in that version of the game, right? Whereas if you try and port it over into another game that has a very different fundamental base, it might not actually work out so well in reality. Then there was another suggestion I see here where people were talking about, what you could do is you could have something like where you have Molten Core, and the structure of Molten Core doesn't really suit this, but you could change it, obviously. And what you could do is you could have the first 3 bosses be like give me's or something like that, or pretty easy, maybe progressive difficulty. And then you hit a wall at like the 4th or 5th boss, and it takes only 20% of players are going to get through that boss when it's current. And then by the time you get to Ragnaros, like 5% or 1% of the player base is killing Ragnaros. And then the idea is that when the next tier comes out, you have kind of access to more easy bosses at the start of that tier combined with the easy boss of the first tier. And then you can basically get more gear from the first raid, because now you're getting gear from 2 raids, so you're better geared, so you can kill more bosses in the first raid. And then you're basically kind of progressing through both raids at the same time. And then you can add a 3rd raid in or something like that. And the idea is to just really gatekeep the hard bosses and the hard items. Sort of like, I don't want to say artificially, but you're making them like way harder than normal. And I think this would just be a disaster. Again, like this is a great example of something that it's solving the problem that we're talking about, right? So all these they're not bad ideas in theory. Like, it's clear that people have logically thought them out and, tried to come up with a solution to the problem that we're talking about. But at the same time, they're just causing so many other problems. Or even if you want to argue that they're not causing other problems necessarily, I would argue that the baseline expectations that have been created and established within the game are, too away now. They've gotten to a point where these ideas would just be kind of incompatible with most of the player base. And I think this idea kind of falls under that category, where the idea is basically like, most people that are playing Classic, they like the whole thing of like, hey guys, I'm raiding with the boys, I'm chilling, I got like the Bud Light in one hand, We're laid back in our gaming chair, and we're just like having a blast, and we don't have a care in the world. And if those people just are only able to kill 3 bosses in a raid, and then they run up against a complete brick wall that they feel like they have no chance of killing, they're just not going to down the boss. And I've made another videos like a couple weeks ago or maybe a week ago about we need more patience in the game, and I do think that is true, and it would be better if players were more patient, and maybe we should try and create systems that maybe cultivate a little bit of that patience. But something like this would be too much too soon, and it would be like just a really hard pill for the vast majority of the community to swallow. We already saw in Season of Discovery, I didn't play this particular raid, but I was kind of watching the drama unfold on Reddit and things of that nature. And that Scarlet Crusade raid that they did after Nax, it didn't look like super hard or anything like that. But it didn't look like super trivially easy either. And a lot of people were like freaking out about that. They were very upset that something like that would be put in the game. They felt that it was incredibly overtuned. I didn't see all of the criticism, but I did see things that even seemed to make sense. For example, like the idea that, how there's a lot of interrupts, I guess, that need to be going off. But like in Classic, interrupting is a little bit different than something in like retail, because there's a lot of things that like, we're still involved with the GCD or something like that, still cost energy. So it can be a little bit more annoying to do interrupts sometimes. But regardless, like, people were already kind of annoyed with that. So imagine if you actually had a raid where, like, 20% of the population killed the 4th boss and there's like 10 bosses in the raid. I feel like that would just be a complete disaster. There'd be people melting down the forums. People would just be quitting in droves. And like I talked about in the prior video, we do have to kind of adjust to the times in some degree, like I was talking about in the leveling video, right? Like, it's never going to be like it was when the game first came out. And when the game first came out in like 2004, it was one of the only games that kind of had this sort of combat style as an MMO. So you were more willing to work with a lot of things. Like if you kind of, hit a point in the game where the progression was super imbalanced or something, you'd be more likely to stick with it, wait for them to fix it, just kind of enjoy other aspects of the game. Nowadays, it's not like that at all, really. And there goes my phone again. It wouldn't be a Power Word Heal video, somebody said, without my phone going on. But you guys know what I mean. So back then, it was kind of the only thing people had access to. Now, if you put people up against that brick wall, everybody is just going to, well, not everybody, but a lot of people are actually just going to quit. And I think it's going to kill a lot of the momentum that the game has. And I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of these just to see here if I can find any others. There's some that are talking about dropping more loot. I like that idea in general. Problem is you still kind of end up with the same problem overall, right? That's another, like, it's a great short-term solution to maybe inspire more participation when you're in maybe like the AQ phase or something like that, to inspire more participation in Molten Core. But again, once you get, like 10 tiers deep or something, you're going to have just issues regardless. So that tends to be a problem. And like I said in my other video where we talked about this a little bit, the horizontal versus vertical progression, I think the solution for this is fresh servers. I know a lot of people don't like that, and we're going to make a video probably on that tomorrow, but I just wanted to kind of get this one out in the interim because you guys inspired me with the comments here. But yeah, I think that is... Oh, there's another one here talking about using the horizontal progression potentially to basically flesh out kind of specs that aren't so great. But in my opinion, we don't really want to do this, right? We want the specs that are bad to be viable at the start of the game, right? Like, I don't want to have a buddy ask me, well, how is Paladin? Can I play the rep Paladin? Is damage Paladin, good in this version of the game? And I'll be like, well, if you get to Blackwing Lair and you do this quest in Blackwing Lair and you unlock this special sword that gives you Crusader Strike, then Ret becomes viable. But until then, it's not really, you can't really play Ret and you have to play Holy. At that point, I feel like that's just, it's not fun, right? And stuff like that sort of only works even to begin with if the class has a good enough base, right? You don't want to have things being made viable by getting certain pieces of gear. Now, people will say that there's some degree of this, like maybe Shakadin is something that could kind of be like this, right? So if you're talking about specs that aren't official specs in the game, so for example, like Shakadin is more like a hybrid character build rather than a spec, right? That's kind of okay. But again, the thing you have to be careful about is the more of these that you allow that are really out there and kind of wild, it has a potential to just have like crazy balance implications, right? So Shakadin, not something that is, I feel like, super overpowered in vanilla, but you could create like a rogue or a mage with kind of really unique items, like again, like a blink item or something like that on a rogue. Could you imagine that in Classic? It would be like so oppressive, right? So you have to really be careful when you add in things like that. And even in those systems, where you're kind of doing a bit more vertical progression like that, unless you drop horizontal progression completely, you are going to inevitably have the same problem, even if it takes longer to get there. So, yeah, just a couple things to keep in mind. Like I said, I love all the comments. It's really fun chatting with you guys in the comment section. So keep them coming, and they don't have to be like fully fleshed out, perfect ideas. Like I said, it's great to just get ideas on the board, but just something to keep in mind that while we technically can solve every problem, we may not want to solve every problem, or some problems may not be worth solving in the ways that that we're thinking of approaching things. So thank you guys for watching. This is sort of a quick one, but we'll talk about fresh servers probably tomorrow, or maybe PvP. I have an idea for a PvP video. So thanks for watching. If you like this, like, comment, and subscribe. And I will talk to you guys next time. See ya.